Greetings once again. As promised, this is my introduction to King Lear, the play King Lear. So I just want to give you some background on the play, on where Shakespeare got the story from, how it was relevant to the culture in Elizabethan or Jacobean England, and that kind of stuff. So this will be fairly quick, hopefully, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so here we go. So Lear was written sometime after 1603 when James I became the king. And during James's reign, the unity of the kingdom was an important theme because there were some challenges to him. And it, of course, is an important theme in the play. In fact, you could argue it's the central point of the play. Shakespeare's tragedies often reflect issues that were in the public arena at the time. It's also relevant that James had two sons, Henry and Charles. Henry, who was the elder, was the Duke of Cornwall, and there's a Duke of Cornwall in the play who is the son-in-law of Lear. The younger son of James was Charles. He would eventually become the King of England, Charles I. He was the Duke of Albany in real life, and in the play, there is a Duke of Albany who is also a son-in-law of the king. In history, Charles, the younger son, inherited the throne after Henry passed away unexpectedly, and Charles went on to become the only English monarch who was executed by his own people. At the end of Charles's reign, that is when he lost his head, England was without a monarch for 11 years, between 1649 and 1660. And eventually that failed attempt at a republic, failed. And so Charles II, the son of Charles I, came back to the throne in 1660, and they carried on with a monarchy ever since. But there was an 11-year period beginning with Charles I, at the end of his reign, in which England was a republic, or what they called a commonwealth, as opposed to a monarchy. So the characters in Lear are modeled after real people. Shakespeare borrowed a lot of his stories from the past, and King Lear is no different. King Lear, spelled L-E-I-R, was a legendary or mythical king of prehistoric Britain. He's sort of like Arthur, but not nearly as well known and not as popular. The opening situation in King Lear has an aged ruler who chooses among his three daughters. And this plot device is right out of a kind of fairy. I mean, you could almost read this in a Grimm's fairy tale, right? His three daughters are forced to tell him how much they love him, and you just know that the youngest daughter is going to get the shaft. She's going to be the one who really loves him, but she doesn't play the game properly, and so she loses. It's sort of like Cinderella, who ends up inheriting these stepsisters who treat her terribly after her father's death. So this is essentially what ends up happening, and it just shows you that Shakespeare borrows his ideas from fairly common tropes, fairly common stories. And in this case, Lear had long since been invented by the time Shakespeare got a hold of him. The immediate source of Shakespeare's story was another play that had been around for a while, and it was called King Lear, L-E-I-R, using the actual spelling of the ancient mythical king's name. And this earlier play presents the same basic situation as Shakespeare's play, but it has a different storyline, quite different actually, and different characters as well. It seems like the earlier play just gave Shakespeare an idea, and then Shakespeare basically wrote a completely different play. He did this a lot in historically based plays, or plays that are based on real people, and in his histories. As well as in Lear, Shakespeare would borrow from a book called The Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, written by a guy named Raphael Holinshed. And it was a massive collection of stuff, some of which was historical fact, but a lot of it was fantasy. Basically, Holinshed made it up. And there were also a lot of folklore elements, such as King Arthur and Lear, people that didn't really exist in history, but did in the popular imagination. Shakespeare also used a contemporary poem by a guy named Strachey. There's evidence that elements of that poem made it into the play. And then a very famous book called Arcadia, written by Sir Philip Sidney, has also been shown to have been a source that Shakespeare would have used. Arcadia is really, really important piece of work, but it's far too dense and difficult to read unless you're really a dedicated English scholar. So you would run into it maybe in fourth year university if you were an English major. Otherwise, you'll never see this thing. Shakespeare also used bits and pieces of other text and blended them together, and what he came up with was basically a very unique version of the story. There was another likely source, and this one is actually kind of my favorite. There was a guy named Samuel Harsnet who was a theologian at the time, and he really, really hated Catholics, which wasn't all that unusual because if you recall the history, Henry VIII eliminated Catholicism in England, dissolved all the monasteries, took all the church property because the Pope refused to give him a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And so he basically made himself the Pope of his own church, and the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And so as a result, Catholics had to go underground because Henry persecuted them. His daughter, Mary Tudor, she was even more efficient at persecuting them. And when Elizabeth came to the throne after Mary's death, she decided that even though Catholicism was illegal in England, she wasn't going to bother them if they didn't become a problem. So they could be Catholic as long as they didn't publish it, didn't proselytize or evangelize people to become Catholics, etc. And of course, so Catholicism, Catholics remained in England. And so there was a constant kind of tension there, and there were these ideas that there were plots that the Catholics were using to overtake the country and make it Catholic again. Anyway, along comes this guy Harsnet who decides he's going to write some things about Catholics. And he wrote this thing called A Declaration Against Egregious Popish Imposture. Basically just means all the ways in which Catholics, especially Jesuit priests, tricked people into believing they were for England when really they were constantly plotting to overthrow the government. So it was a pretty anti-Catholic thing. And in it, Harsnet said that all Catholics, or Jesuits, pardon me, had a troop of demons that they used to help them accomplish their nefarious plots. And he even goes so far as to name the demons and say what they do and what their role is and how the Jesuits use them, and on and on and on and on. What Shakespeare did was he took the names of the demons, which were popular at the time because of Harsnet's book, and also because it just became part of the popular imagination. And Shakespeare takes these demons' names and he puts them in the mouth of somebody who's pretending to be insane in the play. And it's just another way that Shakespeare would connect the play to the audience. So the audience would hear these names and know what they were, right? So there's this idea that he's bridging the gap between the play and the contemporary culture of the audience. The character that uses these names is Tom of Bedlam, who is really Edgar, the son of one of the main figures in the play, who's disguised himself as a crazy person in order to avoid being captured and executed. Anyway, Harsnet's book is pretty interesting, actually. As far as the history of the play is, like most of Shakespeare's, well, pretty much all of Shakespeare's plays, they were very popular during his own lifetime. So he was quite a popular guy while he was alive. It wasn't like, say, Vincent van Gogh, who was penniless when he died and had only sold one painting, and that was to a relative. And he became famous much later. Shakespeare was basically a rock star during his own lifetime. There were several editions of Lear that were published, at least two in his lifetime in quarto form. Quarto is a piece of paper folded twice to create 8 pieces, 4 in the front, 4 in the back. 2 in quarto form, and then there was a fuller version published after his death in 1623 in the First Folio. And the First Folio is pretty much the definitive version of all of Shakespeare's plays. So Lear was reproduced. Lear was performed regularly through his lifetime. Sometime after Shakespeare's death, probably after 1660, the play was deemed by some to be too emotionally challenging, too raw, too difficult to experience, because there's some very, very, very violent scenes in it, and there's the ending is just really depressing. And so what they did was they edited out a number of things. They changed the plot so it's happier at the end, and this was the play that was performed from roughly the late 17th century, pardon me, until late in the 19th century, when Charles Dickens finally said, "Look, I mean, this is crazy. People can take this, and it's a great play. You've killed it by editing all these things out and making it happier." And so Dickens led a charge to reinstate the original play, which was later picked up by George Bernard Shaw and a number of other people. Um, there's a very funny story about Dickens, who, in protest to the changing of Lear, wrote a version of Romeo and Juliet in which both the lovers actually live, and Benvolio actually ends up marrying. Um, is it Paris? I can't remember. Benvolio anyway ends up marrying one of the other male characters because all along Benvolio's actually been a girl, Benvolia, in disguise. So he basically turns Romeo and Juliet into a comedy. Of course, it's a terrible play, and that's the whole point. Dickens was trying to say, look, if you change what Shakespeare wrote, you will inevitably make it worse. So let's bring back the real Lear. And he was quite successful in doing that. So there's a really super quick background of the play. I will talk more in more detail about some of these things as things move on. But there is the background of the actual play. I will post some things online in writing that will help you to fill in some of these gaps. And then I'll post early next week or late this week a reading schedule, and we'll get going on Lear. Okay? Have a great evening.